Minasan ohayou gozaimasu. Thank you all for coming and joining me today. My name is Richard Webb. I'm the author of 80/20 Japanese, which is this book here. And I'm here to talk to you today about developing a better understanding of Japanese sentence structure. So my goal really today is to show you my way of explaining the fundamentals of Japanese grammar and how I believe that giving students a better understanding of how the language really works from the outset, so when they start learning, it can not only help them make better sense of it when they're first starting out, but also provides them with a foundation that they can use and that will benefit them throughout their entire Japanese language education. So before I get into that, I'd just like to take a minute to tell you about myself and how I came to develop this method, I guess. So I started learning Japanese in Year 7, like many students in this country. Then when I was in Year 10, I had the opportunity to go on a student exchange to Osaka. So I spent 6 months there. I lived with a host family, went to regular Japanese classes, had my own Japanese lessons as well. And so by the end of that 6 months, I was quite good conversationally and could talk about pretty much anything that wasn't too technical. So then after returning to Australia, I continued doing Japanese, of course, through to Year 12, and then I went to study arts commerce at Monash University. And so for the arts degree, I majored in Japanese. And so that also gave me the opportunity to go again to Japan. In my third year, I went to Saitama University for 12 months. Fairly different to my high school experience, but most of my classes all of my classes were taught in Japanese, and most of the classes that I chose were about Japanese or Japanese linguistics. Many of them were aimed at students who were, like me, not local Japanese students, international students, but I also took some that were, even some of the Japanese linguistics classes I took were aimed at local Japanese students. So it was that 12 months was really where I sort of filled in all the gaps that I had left over. And so by the end of that, I took the level 1 of the Japanese language proficiency test. It was IQ at the time. It's sort of N1 now. Particularly I got 93% on the grammar and reading comprehension part. I didn't do quite as well on the kanji and vocabulary. That's a huge part of that exam, obviously, in terms of how many things you actually have to know. But what I guess the fact that I was able to get 93% on that grammar part and reading comprehension part, I think reflects how well I understood the language, so that I could work around the words I didn't know and the kanji I couldn't read to still do well and pass overall. So then. After I finished that program, I returned to Australia, finished university here, and then went and decided I've spent all this time learning Japanese, I better go and use it. So I went and found a job in Japan, and I ended up working in Tokyo for a total of 4 years, working for 2 different companies. And both of those were both Japanese companies. Most of the people that worked there were Japanese, and so all day, every day was just using Japanese. And if there were the main thing that I got out of that in terms of Japanese language ability was really just the improving my keigo and just using Japanese in a business context. So then, after those 4 years, I felt like I'd used my Japanese enough. I was pretty satisfied in that respect, but I still felt like After leaving, I knew so much. I felt like I knew so much about Japanese. I had learnt so much over those. It was about 10 years overall, I think. I knew so much, and I could see other people who were learning Japanese struggling with some of the things that I struggled with, back when I was in high school or whatever. And I felt like it would be a waste to not pass that on somehow. All of the experiences that I had. Particularly because I know that a lot of people don't have those experiences that I was fortunate enough to have. I didn't, going to on an exchange program in high school and again in university and then going to work there. Most students don't have that opportunity. So, and a lot of the things that I learnt in that time were things that they're not covered in textbooks. Teachers might, as teachers, you might teach these things to students, but if it's not written down somewhere, it's easy to miss parts. And so I really wanted to put put it all together into a book, and so I wrote, and that's when I decided to sit down and write 80/20 Japanese. I basically, my intention with this book was to make it the book that I wish I had had when I started learning. So that fills in all those gaps, so I didn't have to do all the work myself. Okay. So the main problem that I sort of felt I wanted to solve was that throughout my now Japanese language education has probably changed a fair bit since when I started, at least on a classroom level. But textbooks, I don't know if they've evolved that much. Generally, what we would be taught was how to say different things, and that's good. The goal is to communicate. You want to be able to say and communicate and have conversations, and just being able to converse is obviously a major part of what you should be aiming for. But I sort of felt like there were all these things, and they didn't tie together in one clear way. There was nothing that really tied them all together. So you'd learn one thing and then you think, oh yeah, I understand how this works. And then you learn something else and you think, oh, that doesn't quite match up with that. And you have to kind of keep figuring things out as you go. And so that was sort of one of the big challenges that I wanted to, I guess, make easier for students learning now. And another thing that I think also depends on what age people start learning. I wrote my book intended for adults mainly, people who are self-studying. So it's not really aimed at the school environment, I suppose. But one of the things that I kind of got the feeling was that a lot of people who are learning Japanese, or they start learning Japanese, they think, oh my gosh, it's so hard, it's so confusing, I don't understand how this works. And then they continue believing that, thinking that it's okay, it's just this really difficult, mystical language that I'll never understand. As long as I can communicate in it, that's all. And they kind of resign themselves to just not... They resign themselves to the idea that they won't fully understand it and exactly how everything works. And so I sort of wanted to do something about that. And so, so one of the things that comes from that is the assumptions that we make. So when we're learning, or every day as humans, we make assumptions about things. We need to do that in order to understand the things around us in the world. And so when we don't understand something fully, our brains kind of make it up so that it does make sense. We find patterns based on things that we've learned before, and try to find a way for that new information to sort of fit into that pattern. And so I think particularly with learning languages, that can be good. It works. I think that works better for us for some languages than others. So if you're learning a language like Spanish, for example, word order is very similar. So if a student is learning Spanish and they learn the words that they need to be able to say a particular or express a particular idea, if they kind of put the words in some sort of order, then based on what they know of what is natural to them in English, then they'll probably be pretty close. But in Japanese, that doesn't really work because the languages are so fundamentally different. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to stop people from making these assumptions, you're going to make assumptions no matter what, but avoid the major, the more detrimental ones, I suppose. And so one of the ones that I remember, I felt, one of the assumptions that I know that I made was take a sentence like "Watashi wa genki desu." We knew that watashi means I and genki means fine or well, but des was always kind of understood to me, at least, as this kind of, it's just a polite way to end a sentence. And so if I had watashi wa and then genki desu at the end, it kind of felt like what was the thing that connected those two things together. And therefore, in English, the way that, if we say I am well, then the word that does that is am. So I remember in the early days of my learning Japanese, I remember thinking that what meant am. And then I got to a sentence like, watashi wa sushi o tabemashita, for example. And that doesn't fit. Obviously, what doesn't mean am in that sentence at all. But I couldn't figure out. I couldn't figure out why that was, and I just, like I said before, I just assumed that Japanese was this difficult language, this mystical language that I was never going to understand. So I just accepted it and moved on. Another similar assumption that I made, and I know other people have made as well, is that you kind of attach the particles with the verb. So if you take a sentence from before, watashi wa sushi o tabemashita, anytime a student, particularly in the early years of learning Japanese, anytime they see the word tabemasu, it's going to be preceded by o every time. And I remember thinking, oh, well, when you use tabemasu, you use o. And when you say shimasu, you use o. And you say ikimasu, you say ni. And it wasn't, and I kind of had there's this kind of understanding, or this, I suppose, intuitive feeling that the word order is what determined the meaning. And so if I say watashi wa, it goes at the beginning, and then we have whatever we're going to eat goes in the middle, and then o tabemashita at the end. There wasn't, I think, even though I did understand what particles were and how they worked, it wasn't as clear as I think it could have been. And now, I'm not saying that, obviously, not all students make these assumptions. Maybe nobody else does. I know some people have made, certainly the first assumption. I've had people, I've explained what I'm about to explain to you, and they've come back and said, no, des is just a polite word. What means am? And I said, no. So there are people that make these assumptions. And so I wanted to do something about that. And any other assumptions that people might make. They're going to be different for everyone. So my solution really was when teaching Japanese, was to start from the beginning by giving students a really solid, a proper understanding of the sentence structure and particularly how that differs from English. Because we use, so I forgot to mention this earlier, but when we're making these assumptions, if you're learning another language, then for English speakers, English forms the basis of those assumptions. And for English, word order is a major part of that, for example. And so that leads us to assume that things in Japanese are going to be the same. But so I wanted to sort of explain that there is this logical system and explain that there is this core sort of sentence structure model, I suppose, that everything fits into. And so what that does is that it means that when they're starting, when a student is starting, they can see how everything sort of works. It's obviously still going to be difficult because it's new and it's very different. But they can see that there is a kind of logical order to it, and they don't resign themselves to the idea that I'm never going to fully understand this. And then the other thing is that once they understand this model properly, then they can everything that they ever learn about Japanese, they'll have something that they can tie that to, and they can see how it fits into the bigger picture. Okay, so what is this core sentence structure that I am talking about? Okay, so I start with there are two main rules for determining the meaning of a sentence in Japanese. The first one is the verb is the central part of the sentence. Everything revolves around the verb. And then particles define the role of all the other pieces of information in relation to that verb, not word order, as we do in English. So so it looks kind of like something like this. You have this verb, and then everything connects to that verb somehow via a particle. Now, there are other things and I'll get to that later, there are other ones that don't require a particle. But for the most part, the main pieces of information in a sentence, the main things that are involved in any action, any activity, connect to that verb somehow via a particle. So if we compare this to how English works, English, the central part is very different because we have subject, verb, object, and the relationship between those three words is determined entirely by the word order. So even if we have a sentence that has so I've got topic in the Japanese version and subject in the English because I didn't want to get into the debate of wa versus ga today. That'll take more than the 55 minutes I have. But if we assume for now that subject and topic are the same thing, the way that information relates to the verb is in English, it's 100% based on word order. We know what the subject is based on the fact that it comes before the verb. Whereas in Japanese, the only thing that determines that is the particle, and the word order is nowhere near as important. For everything else, it's very similar. So prepositions in English that link things like time, location, means, for example, they work very much like particles. They go before instead of after, but because they're not part of that core central part of the sentence, they can also go in kind of any order. I'll look at an example of that in a moment. But another thing, and this is kind of a side note that's not hugely relevant, but the green parts here in both of these are also the bare minimum that you need to form a grammatically complete sentence in either language. So, with the exception that in English there is no object, you don't need an object. So if you take a verb, if you take a thing like I bought a pen, right? If I'm talking to somebody, even if the person that I'm talking to knows that I'm talking about me, and they know that I'm talking about a pen, and if they ask me, who bought it, for example, I can't just respond by saying bought, or I bought, or bought it. I have to say I bought it. Colloquially, people will leave out these things to just to save time, I suppose. But for the most part, for a sentence to be grammatically complete, it has to have all three parts. Whereas in Japanese, if someone asks the same question, I could just respond by saying "kaimashita." You don't need to include the information it's not in this green part. And so that's another sort of I guess that's a bit of a sidebar to that, but it does sort of also reflect the way that the different pieces of information relate to that main verb, as it were. So if we look at a basic example of this, so I've got Taro and Noriko at the library. So in English, again, word order tells us that Taro is the one that saw Noriko. Because Taro comes before the verb, we know that Taro is the one that saw her. And because Noriko comes after the verb, we know that she is the one that was seen. In Japanese, the only thing that tells us that information, the thing that tells us that information, is the particle. The word order doesn't matter. So because O comes after Noriko, we know that Noriko is the person that was seen. And similarly, Taro wa, because we mark Taro with wa, that's how we know who it was that actually did the scene. Another example, which is a little bit different in that so this doesn't have an object. So Taro went from the station to school, Noriko by car. There's more elements here, but there's no object. So in English, we can leave out the object because there isn't one. But the same thing still applies with the Taro went. That word order tells us what it means. And so all of the other elements in English are related via the preposition. And the order of those doesn't really matter. We can say Taro went by car to the station, from the station to school with Noriko, or we can change it to any other order. We can rearrange the preposition, the words defined by prepositions, or marked by prepositions. But we must keep subject-verb together. Whereas in Japanese, we can kind of rearrange everything. That's not to say that we always should, but in terms of the fundamental meaning of a sentence, because we have those particles, the word order is not so important. Sorry. So, by starting with this, this is really designed to show students how the words relate to each other in a sentence in a way that can form meaning. But of course, we obviously have to put them in some sort of word order, so we need some rules or something to tell us what order to put them in. So I have a couple of we can start with a couple of really basic rules that keeps things really simple. So we start with the topic, if it's used, goes at the beginning of the sentence. The verb goes at the end, and then everything else goes in between, and it can go in any order because we have those particles. So it looks something like this. You have topic wa, and then whatever else, other information you want to include can go in between, as long as you keep the particle together with the thing that it's defining, and then the verb at the end. Now, obviously, this isn't an absolute rule that applies to everything, because especially as students become more advanced, they'll start using wa in different locations in a sentence. And also, just because we don't, it doesn't matter which order we put them in terms of the meaning of the sentence, doesn't mean that it doesn't affect the emphasis. So, for example, elements that appear later in a sentence, information that appears later in a sentence generally has more emphasis. But in terms of the fundamental meaning and what is trying to be communicated, the word order is not important. What matters more is the particles. So if we apply this this sort of model, I suppose, to our example from earlier, if it will work. So we have Taro to Noriko at the library. We have Taro wa at the beginning, Mimashita at the end, and then we have in the other information section we have Noriko o and Toshokan de, and we can put that in any order. So we can say Taro wa Noriko o Toshokan de mimashita, or we can say Taro wa Toshokan de Noriko o mimashita. And because we have that particle combined with that word, the word order doesn't really affect the meaning. Again, like I said, the emphasis in that sentence will be different. If I say Taro wa Noriko o Toshokan de mimashita, it sort of implies that that's where he saw her. But if it's Taro wa Toshokan de Noriko o mimashita, where it sort of puts more emphasis on the fact that Noriko is the person who he saw. But in terms of what actually occurred, if we're not worried about the emphasis, that the word order doesn't really matter. So if we look at our other example, so here we have a lot more things, and so again we have Taro wa at the beginning, ikimashita is our verb at the end, and then all these other things in the middle. Noriko to eki kara gakkou ni kuru made, and we can rearrange these in any order. So we can say Taro wa eki kara gakkou ni kuru made noriko to ikimashita, or any of these other ones. And if my maths is correct, I think there are 24 alternatives of how this sentence can be phrased. And all of them are correct, because what matters is not the word order, what matters is the particles. And again, the emphasis will be different, but the emphasis is something that we can worry about later. If we first understand how things actually work and how things fit together, then later on we can say, okay, now if you want to emphasize this, you do this, and so on. So from here, once students can understand this and see how particles work in this model, basically everything else they ever need to learn involves expanding one of these things. And so what it also means, and because we're just expanding on this, it also means that everything they ever learn, if they learn something new somewhere completely different, they can bring it back and say, how does that fit into this? And they have that central model that they can tie it back into. So how do we do that? How do we expand each part? Well, the first obvious way is to use different verb tenses, different verb forms. That's a very easy way to add more information. The next thing we can do is we can add more particles. There's more than I've listed there as well. And we can just essentially add more, things participating in the activity. There's also other information that we can add. So I've got, for example, in the main section, I've got time. Timing doesn't always need the particle need, but for argument's sake, let's say that it does most of the time. But there's also timing expressions like frequency and duration. So instead of nichiyoubi ni or kinyoubi ni or whatever, you have things like mainichi ichijikan, and then adverbs as well. And so, again, because of all of this stuff in the other information section, is the word order again is secondary to using those blocks, I suppose, as a whole. For most of them, that includes using a particle. For the ones like frequency, duration, and adverbs, it doesn't. But so if we take a sentence like, watashi wa mainichi toshokan de benkyou shimasu, that mainichi and toshokan de parts, we can swap that and say, watashi wa toshokan de mainichi benkyou shimasu. Those elements can be moved around within that other information section. It's the same with if I said, watashi wa 1 jikan toshokan de benkyou shimasu. 私は図書館で1時間勉強します。We can move those around. Same with adverbs. We can say 私は静かに図書館で勉強します。Or we can say 私は図書館で静かに勉強します。Anything in that other information section can essentially be moved around freely. So the next major thing, the other hugely important way in which we can expand on this basic structure is to look at each of these individual blue things in particular. So, well, it applies to the others as well, but the blue ones, if you notice, they're all things. Things are represented by nouns. So what we can do is we can add more information about those nouns, about those things, by building more detailed noun phrases. So a noun phrase is any phrase that describes a single thing, and therefore it acts like a noun in a grammatical sense. So if I'm talking about a car is a noun, but a car is a noun phrase on its own, but a car is a noun phrase. A blue car is a noun phrase. My car, my blue car, the car that I bought yesterday. These are all noun phrases and they all refer to one thing, a car. And so we can expand we can add as much information about that car as we want and use it in the same way in a sentence as we would if we only used the word car. So if we take a simple sentence like 太郎は車で学校に行きました. We can expand we can expand any of the blue parts. I'm not going to expand on Taro because I think that's enough information about him. But we can take kuruma and say 私は青い車で学校に行きました. Oh, sorry, 太郎は. We can say 太郎は私の車で学校に行きました.太郎は私の青い車で学校に行きました. Or we can say 太郎は私が昨日買った青い車で学校に行きました. And so we're just expanding adding more information to this noun. And of course we can do the same with 学校. So we can say 太郎は車で大きい学校に行きました. 太郎は車で近所の学校に行きました. 太郎は車で近所の大きい学校に行きました。太郎は車で最近工事が終わった近所の大きい学校に行きました。And so because each of these are essentially isolated from each other, we can use any of these in any combination. So I can say 太郎は私が昨日買った青い車で最近工事が終わった近所の大きい学校に行きました。And also because they're in the other information section, we can swap it around. We can put the destination before the mean. So we can say 太郎は近所の学校に私の青い車で行きました。And so that's really the between that and adding what we had on the previous slide in terms of adding different verb tenses, different verb forms, that really opens that is enough to understand pretty much anything that a student will ever learn about Japanese. And in particular, what this does is it opens the door to a lot of expressions that are actually based on noun phrases. So the most common one, or the most easily understood one, is ことがあります. So 私は日本に行ったことがあります. This is probably most commonly taught as an expression that just ends in 何々したことがあります. But really what it is日本に行ったこと is a noun phrase. And that noun phrase describes my experience of having gone to Japan. So we're saying 私は日本に行ったことがあります. I have that experience of having gone to Japan, just as we would say 私はペンがあります. So you can see how that fits into the overall structure of the model that we had from before. Another noun phrase based expression is 方がいい. あなたは6時までに帰った方がいいです. 6時までに帰った方 is another noun phrase. It's a little bit more abstract in terms of what it means on its own, but it acts like any other noun phrase and can be used in a sentence the same way as, say, 頭. あなたは頭がいいです. Another one is 前に and 後に. ご飯を食べる前に手を洗ってください. ご飯を食べる前 is a noun phrase that refers to a point in time, just like 6時 is a point in time. 6時に手を洗ってください. And so with this, if once students can learn how to form noun phrases, all of these kinds of expressions become, I think, more easily understood in terms of how it fits into the overall picture, rather than remembering them as isolated individual expressions that you just use. This is how you use it, and that's what it is. Sorry, and yeah, with this one again, because of the particles, we can change the order and say te o gohan gohan o taberu mai ni harate kudasai. We can swap those around because we have the particles there. I won't go how much. So another one is yo ni naru. 私は早く日本語が話せるようになりたい。日本語が話せるよ is, I guess, a state of being that I want to become. Just like 私は大人になりたい。Both of these are expressed as nouns, as noun phrases. And are therefore used in a sentence in the same way. And they all fit back into that main model that we had from earlier. So some more expressions I won't go into in detail, but things like tameni, okage, hazu, beki, kigasuru. There are more, but they are all of these are formed using a noun phrase, and that fits into that model from earlier as one of those, I guess, as one of those blue parts within the overall sentence. And so what that means is that for everything that they ever learn, no matter how a student ever learns, no matter how complex it might get, it all comes back and fits into this model somehow. It does get more complicated. Some things are a little bit harder to see how they fit into this, but ultimately they all do fit into this structure. And if students can understand that, the way that the information relates to each other, particularly with all of the noun-based things are related to the verb somehow by a particle, then I think it becomes easier to understand. So my main goal with this approach really is it's about building that foundation early. That main structure that can be used as a reference point for a student so that from the beginning they can see how things work, they can see the logic behind it all, and it makes more sense from the beginning, but it also means that for the rest of their education they have something that they can tie everything back to. I've included the word visible because I felt obligated to. But one of the points of that is to make the differences and the similarities as well between Japanese and English to be more visible. Because the more we understand our own language and how our own language works, the more we can sort of see. If you're trying to figure out why something works in another language, we have something to compare it to and say, oh, it's very, very similar, or it's very, very different. So it also it'll because we're making it very clear from the outset how things work. It allows them to avoid some of the incorrect assumptions. Everyone learning any language is going to make incorrect assumptions no matter what. But the biggest one with Japanese is sort of getting away from the idea that we're so used to and it's so ingrained in us speaking English, is that word order is an important part of that. Getting away from that idea is more easily done, I think, if you can understand and see the differences. And so what it does, it shows that there is really a clear link between all of the different concepts in Japanese. If they have this one thing they can tie everything back to, it all makes sense. And yes, Japanese does make sense. It's not this mystical, confusing language that nobody ever understands. It's just different, and it takes a different approach, I think. Okay, so that's pretty much everything. If anyone's got any questions, I'd love to hear them. Oh.